Angushtha Matra, that which is not bigger than the thumb, as a description of that inner being, the psychic being. That is to say, when you enter into it, it is found to be a kind of an entity, very small entity. That is because it is in the ocean of ignorance so much, and there it is one thing jutting out, as it were. Although it is that entity which is the manifestation of the Sanatana Jiva, which is the portion of the Supreme Reality, which is infinite and eternal. So, it is when we enter into this consciousness of the psychic entity that one begins to have the experience of immortality. Now, there are many descriptions of the experience of immortality in our literature. And when you read the literature of India in regard to moksha and immortality and so on, there are many descriptions, sometimes varied descriptions, and therefore one can't say whether this is this one or this one or this one. In Sri Aurobindo's description, therefore, all of them are described, and you might say that all of them may be regarded as a state of moksha. And yet, the real is the moksha is when you attain to the realization of the Supreme. But in between this realization of the Supreme and the realization of the psychic entity also as an immortal, there is this question of the body, life and mind. The true individuality, psychic consciousness, is the true individual consciousness which is unegoistic. So, usually our individuality is measured by our egoistic consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo makes a distinction between egoistic consciousness and the true individuality. The true individuality is not egoistic. The true individuality is always an eternal portion of the Supreme. As a portion, it is individual, but portion of the Supreme, it is the Supreme itself. And this Supreme is not only transcendental but also universal. Therefore, this individuality by nature is universal and transcendental, by its very fundamental nature. It's not egoistic. So, individual consciousness, which is universal and transcendental at the same time, that is the true experience of individuality. So, that experience of the true individuality, which is realized by universality and transcendence, is the experience of the psychic immortality, the individual experience of individual immortality. And when you attain to this experience, Sri Aurobindo calls it moksha. But when that individuality is able to reflect itself in the outer formation of the mind, and how that can happen is a long process. But according to Sri Aurobindo, it can happen. The individual consciousness of the psychic being can go on reflecting itself in the mind in such a way that that mind also becomes individualized, is able to participate in the individuality of the psychic consciousness. In other words, when that formation of the mind is also universalized, just as individual psychic consciousness is also universal, when mind formation also is universalized and is able to harmonize with universalization, not by expanding, we normally do expanding, but inwardly when you attain to this inner connection of the individual and universal, when that happens, according to Sri Aurobindo, then that mental formation, whatever that mental formation has grown, without disintegration, it can continue on and on and on. And that is mental immortality. Similarly, our vital consciousness, if it is also individualized in the same way, then that vital being also becomes immortal. And when Sri Aurobindo says that Hanuman is the immortal vital force dedicated to the divine, it is that vital being is immortal. And these are some of the examples as to how some mental beings are immortal, some vital beings are immortal. As far as the physical being being immortal, and that is a big question mark. According to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, this state of consciousness which is described here, physical being widens itself, is also a question of universalization of the physical consciousness. If the physical being becomes widened and is upheld by the gods and by the Supreme Aditi, then that physical being can become immortal. And in one of the talks, Mother has said that it is quite possible that some of the Vedic rishis are even now alive, even physically. It's quite possible because here it is spoken of immortal and physical being, so it is quite possible. Now this yoga by which physical being can become immortal is one of the most important elements of the yoga of Sri Aurobindo. The aim that he has also put forward is not only moksha. He does not deny the moksha. Moksha is a necessary part, necessary stage of development, but it is not the aim. The aim is immortality of the body. And here, very clearly, when this description is given in the Veda, the immortality is referred to the immortality of the physical being. Prithvi vitaste. This is the text, however much you may try to interpret, but that you cannot come out of the word Prithvi vitaste. It is the physical consciousness which has become widened, universalized. And Sri Aurobindo confirms it, that physical being, the physical consciousness can be universalized. But here there is a question of visitation. Sri Aurobindo has, in his interpretation, has put the word physical being is visited. Whether it can be stabilized and made permanent on and on, whether that becomes possible, this is the question. And in fact, you might say that Sri Aurobindo's yoga can be rightly understood from this angle. What was the attempt of the yoga of Sri Aurobindo? Sri Aurobindo's attempt was to deal with this question of death of the body and to ask whether physical body can be so individualized so that universality and individuality of the physical is identified. And if that is done, then the physical being, without the law of disintegration, it can continue to live on and on. Now, Sri Aurobindo says this is not for the glory of the body, it is not for the sake of an achievement and a kind of great glorification. It is connected with the very aim, what is the intention of the soul in his state of bondage. is the soul here only to return back to its own original condition from where it came? Or is soul here on the earth for doing something which is some very special thing to be done on the earth, not to return? And this is where Sri Aurobindo's view of liberation differs from the many views of liberation that we find in Indian literature. According to the Indian philosophical systems, the aim of our life here on the earth is to return and to liberate ourselves from the bondage of the world and to achieve our identity with the Supreme, or our dependence on the Supreme, our bhakti to the Supreme, and to remain in that eternal condition. And that is all, that is the end, that is moksha. According to Sri Aurobindo, that is attainment of essential immortality, but that is not the aim for which the soul is here on the earth. The soul is here on the earth for divinization of the body, for the divinization of life on the earth. As Sri Aurobindo says, if the aim was to return back, what was the point in its coming into the world? It was already liberated in its original condition. The soul is always liberated. Why does it enter into this earth? Now, this is a very important question, and I'll take a little more time on this because that is central also to the understanding of the Veda. And this is the question for my own personal research at present, in fact. And therefore, it can be very useful to share this idea with everybody who is learned in this matter. According to what I understand of the Veda, the individual soul is not so very clearly stated in the Veda, but you get some glimpses of what is the view of individual in the Veda. There is a clear idea of universal gods, clear idea of Aditi, the clear idea of the Supreme. But the individual, what is the individual? Who is the individual? Who is traveling? Who is the Yajman? On this, one has to make a lot of research to be very clear about. But whatever I have studied, I can share with you, and my feeling is that according to the Veda, the original unconsciousness of which we spoke earlier, when the darkness was wrapped in darkness, and when Agni was planted on the earth, and along with Agni, there was also the descent of Purusha and the Supreme Aditi, and they also established themselves on the earth. And since the individual is the eternal portion of the Supreme, the individuals also must have come down along with Aditi and Supreme Purusha and Agni. Therefore, this what we call we ourselves, the true individuals that we are, although now egoistic, limited, groping, but originally we are those eternal portions of the Supreme. And therefore, we also have come down on the earth. In fact, according to many Indian philosophies, this question has remained obscure. According to some, the bondage of the individual is eternal, anadi. Although they say that it is not ananta, because you can break out of the bondage and you can get liberated. But on this question, when I critically examine the theories of soul and bondage and evolution, I find a lot of confusion on this subject. And yet it is the central subject. I mean, we are all here on this earth for what? We must know what we are